Hi everyone, my name is Melody Ray and I am coming from the Healing Patch Children's Grief Program located in West Central Pennsylvania. I would like to thank the Highmark Caring Place for inviting me to be a part of the 2022 virtual Children's Grief Awareness Day events taking place that all of us can enjoy and gather and gain information on supporting grieving children. So I was putting some thought to the theme for this year, which is because grief. And the statement that continued to come to my mind is, because grief, I deserve support and honesty. I think of that in terms of children's grief universally, from whatever the cause of death was for the person that they are grieving. So I'm here today to talk to you about the children's book that I had written, talk to you about the importance of being open and honest with children when having those conversations while supporting their caregivers, as well as talk to you about a few activities that could be done individually with grieving children, as well as an activity that could be done in a peer support model. So I'd like to start with telling you a little bit about the book that I had written. Someone I love died from a drug overdose. This book was written in 2017 and published in 2018. It was written in response to calls that we were receiving at the Healing Patch. Just about every other call in 2016 and 2017 was due to a substance overdose. Prior to that time, those type of deaths were random. We most certainly worked with families that lost a loved one this way, but there was a higher concentration. And when I went back and looked at national statistics, in 2017, according to the CDC, over 72,000 Americans died from a substance overdose. And those numbers continue to rise, whereas in 2021, 107,000 Americans died from a substance overdose. And with the ripple effects of that, there are thousands and thousands of grieving children across our country that are losing someone they love. And so I felt that it needed to be brought to attention and that resources needed to be brought to caregivers on having honest and frank conversations and giving, quite honestly, permission to be able to talk to children about the way their loved one died. In the calls that I was getting, the most common questions were, do I tell them? If I do tell them, how do I tell them? What language do I use? Do I tell them everything? And those type of things. So we most certainly in the grief field had a lot of this knowledge with the other stigmatized cause of death, suicide, and the importance of being open and honest with children. So the idea is to give children the information in small, bite-sized pieces that they can absorb. So language like, your loved one took too much of a medicine or drug and that caused their body to stop working. They had the disease of addiction. So I also had, falling back on me, I was, prior to my work as a grief specialist, I worked in the drug and alcohol field. So I was very knowledgeable on the idea of the disease concept, the idea that addiction is a disease, that although someone may make a bad choice, that does not make them a bad person, that addiction causes structural changes in the mind that can be permanent, and that addiction, just like any other disease, requires care, attention. It requires special treatment, lifestyle changes, and unfortunately, just like other diseases, it can also involve relapse and death as well. So coming from that lens of viewing it as not a character defect, but a disease, was kind of the lens I was writing from to write this children's book, as well as understanding that children get their identity from their parents. And so if we are using language that is dehumanizing to individuals, that children can feel that impact as well. One of the biggest questions that families will ask is, if I tell them how their person died, doesn't that make it like that's an okay thing, or that they might have the idea? And if anything we've learned from like suicide loss is that being open and honest with children and explaining that someone has a disease and explaining healthier coping skills to deal with such diseases leads to children making better lifestyle choices for themselves. Withholding that information, children tend to find out anyway. They tend to find out from other people in the family about the death, or they overhear. And that can create a lot of mistrust in the adults. It can create a lot of anger. Children have said that they feel like they have to re-grieve their person after finding out the truth. So it can certainly complicate the grief process when told this information a long time later, or they find out and then they're stuck dealing with that information and dealing with that information in isolation, which is never, never good. And then the weight that family secret can then have on the entire family. So, tiptoeing around, carrying that weight, adults trying not to slip up with language, that takes a lot of energy to do that. And they're already spending an exorbitant amount of energy on grieving the person that they lost and all of the feelings that are part of that. And so in some ways, it actually can halt or hinder the grieving process by withholding that or holding on to that. So that's a good bit on why the book was written, some different ideas on some language to use with grieving children, and why I had written the children's book. So I just wanted to share with you a little bit about the story of Tommy. His relationship with his person was he saw his dad's addiction. He saw, the idea of his dad falling asleep on the couch, taking medications from the cupboard and not being able to wake dad up, and how frustrating this was. Dad going to rehab and dad coming back and doing well, and then dying from an overdose. So Tommy's story is that he was around his person all the time. And we've recognized here, just like any loss to death, that the relationship and what that looked like definitely plays a role in the grief process. So there are kids that had lost their loved one, that their person was in and out of their lives. They were inconsistent, or they had little contact due to ongoing substance abuse. And the ongoing theme with that is the hope that they would have been able to reconnect with their person, that their person would have had long periods of sobriety and been a bigger role in their life. There's also, unfortunately, the children that are finding their loved ones that had died from a substance overdose and all of the trauma related to that. So it's important to note that just like with any loss to death, the relationship to that person certainly plays a role in that. And these are just some from my personal experience at the Healing Patch of what we see with that dynamic with the person that died. The idea, though, regardless of how involved the father, mother, primary caregiver was, that it is a parent, if it is a parent loss, that is going to have significant impact on that child and that child's development. So it's important to note that. I just wanted to make sure I threw that in there, because people sometimes think, well, they didn't see their dad all that often, so are they even really grieving? And the words are absolutely. They still are grieving. So that was the story of Tommy, some other families' dynamics. And I also put in the children's book, I would have read it to you today, but it's a little bit too long. And I wanted to spend some time just talking about some of these concepts with you. The book also includes some kid-friendly definitions and explanations. So it talks about what overdose is, when someone takes too much medicine, drugs, or alcohol, and the body stops working. The overdose can cause the person to die or possibly have health problems that may last their entire life. Words like addiction, recovery, relapse. As well as at the end of the book, we thought it was important to include a my story. So the kids to share their relationship with their person, their thoughts and feelings related to the loss to death, their feelings towards the substance that caused their person to die. So all of that is written here, and it's the activity I wanted to share with you is the idea of using journaling or telling my stories and the importance of how that can help children in their grief process. This is something very much that primary caregivers can do with children, and they can add to their stories. And with a substance overdose, sometimes people are worried that can define the person. By sharing their story and talking about them as a person and their legacy aside from their substance use, who they were, what made them uniquely them, what their talents were, what their skills were. All of that can be shared with the child in helping to create their identity. Oh, my dad, played football in high school. That's really cool. I just started playing football at my school. So finding, some good and healthy connections related to that person can be very beneficial in the grief journey. So that's one example, is in the children's book that I had written, the My Story, but there's lots of others. So I don't want to keep it specific to substance overdose loss, that there's a lot of other type of journaling books out there that that parents and caregivers could look up and find and use them with children. So another example is Love Never Stops, the Healing Book, and some wonderful resources from the Dougie Center, some specific workbooks. After a suicide death, after a murder, and after a death, a generalized book, an activity book for children. And the last I'd like to share is a resource for children or teens that had lost a loved one to suicide. Out of the Shadows, a journal for teens who have someone they love complete suicide. So journaling can be awesome. Telling my story, sharing all of that can be a great way for family members to come together and support each other and be a part of that child's narrative for their grief process. I also wanted to share with you an activity that we use at the Healing Patch that was really beneficial in our peer support model. Our support groups, it's a loss to death of any way. So we recognize, so there's children in our peer support groups that lost a loved one to substance overdose, suicide, cancer, any significant loss to death. And we had found that there were kids in that group that were really open in sharing their story about how their person died. And in particular, some teen girls that were very open to sharing about their dad having and struggling with addiction, finding dad, trying to hide his body so that younger siblings wouldn't see it, and the struggles with that and the feelings with that, and very open with that. And there were some other kids that were much more reserved, that weren't necessarily as comfortable sharing their stories. So we wanted to try to create that dialogue and create an environment for folks to openly share their stories. This was in a tween-teen age group, so mostly it was kids older than 11 or 12 in this support group. And they had already gone through the phases of kind of developing trust, doing some icebreakers, and they all kind of had some good connections before we threw this activity in the loop, which this activity is called How Did You Hear? And it is from the Fernside Idea Book. So that's what I'm referencing. And basically, it's the idea of putting these cards in order of, if you want to start them in any particular order. We particularly put when and how did you find out about the death as the first card that would be flipped. And we started with the members that were open to sharing. So they were open to share with the group. And that definitely created an environment where, okay, I can talk about this. And some of the members that had never shared before how their loved ones had died then became comfortable to share. Not only the other members that lost a loved one to substance overdose, but also our members a member that had lost her mother to cancer and was home when her mother died and saw her mother's body. So although very vastly different causes of death, the idea of being home, the idea of, being witness to that, and all of the thoughts and feelings along with that, they were able to connect on. So I can't speak highly enough of just these little simple cards to get that conversation going once there's some rapport and trust with the group. The next card is, what were you told? Do you wish you had been told in a different way? Did you believe it? When did it start to seem real to you? Did you wonder or have any questions about anything? Who did you tell? And what was their reaction? So some really great conversation starters. So that is all I have for you today. Thank you all so much for tuning in and listening. And I really encourage all of you to check out childrensgriefawarenessday.org so that you can learn more things to watch, read, and do to support grieving children nationally and internationally. Thank you all so much. You take care.